Again, I'm Melinda Bowen. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Center for Legal Inclusion. We're so excited to have everyone on today for our first Resource Roundtable for our Wednesday webinars for those that are just joining us for the first time. Every Wednesday at 4 p.m., we have a webinar that addresses different legal topics or legal careers that we hope can be informative and helpful for those who might be considering a legal job or going to law school, or who are just interested in legal topics. So today our book is maybe less legal, but it's more discussing the role of history and different viewpoints in history, which I think informs a lot of the things that we actually do in the law. And today we have with us to discuss the book, which was by Paul Ortiz, and it's titled An African American and Latinx History of the United States. We have Assistant Professor of History at BYU, Dr. David James Gonzales. Dr. Gonzales is a native of Southern California, and he began his collegiate studies at Southwestern Community College in Chula Vista, California, and then completed his bachelor's in history summa cum laude at UC San Diego. In 2017, he completed a PhD in history at USC and wrote his dissertation on the Mexican-American struggle against segregation in Orange County. And I found it interesting that a lot of his research focuses on Orange County in particular and the role of Latinx communities and politics in the socio-spatial development of Southern California. So a very specific research focus that I think is really relevant for some of our students who may be joining from that area or who may be from that area and are going to school in Utah. And he's also a producer and host of a podcast called New Books in Latino Studies, which is part of the New Books Network, available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and on demand at a website that's available on his bio. And I can include that in the chat in just a moment. But outside of his academic work now at BYU, he's worked in mortgage finance and for-profit higher education, and he is married with 4 kids. So we're very excited to have Dr. Gonzales here to talk about our book for this month. Thank you again for joining us. Maybe we can just jump into the book by starting to talk about some terms, right? So throughout the book, Paul Ortiz uses and reiterates several terms. And I'm wondering if you can help define for those who hadn't finished the book or didn't read the book, or for those just so that we can be on the same page. Those terms that I thought stood out to me anyway were American exceptionalism, racial capitalism, and emancipatory internationalism. What do those terms mean, to provide some context for this book?
Great questions, and I'll begin in that order. American exceptionalism is perhaps the term we're most familiar with, and it's essentially, a belief that we should emphasize is promoted through our socialization process, primarily through educational institutions, but also through cultural production, movies, music, etc., some other types of images. But it's the belief that America, as Paul Ortiz quotes, Frederick Douglass, is of American innocence, right? And of its exceptionality, particularly in the notion that it hasn't encountered the problems of the world, like particularly Europe, right? That was the apparently frame of reference that the founding fathers, that we tell ourselves, right, compared themselves to exclusively. And when we're saying that they didn't address those problems, or it didn't encounter the same problems, we're primarily referring to colonialism, the history of colonialism, and imperialism, that America itself wasn't a colonial or imperialist power, that it's always been a nation, a bastion of democracy, that's been, for the founding truths of, say, political equality, natural rights, sovereignty of the people, etc., right? And so imperialism, colonialism don't really fit with those things, right? Those political ideals. But also, in particular, that it's a nation that hasn't experienced the social disruptors or the class fissures, right, of Europe, right? So that class inequality or other forms of inequality weren't inherent, within our nation's founding and development, right? Because that's part of the story of America, right? That immigrant groups came here to escape those forms of oppression. And so the idea that if that was replicated here, it kind of goes counter to the storytelling. So
Right.
that's essentially the notion of American exceptionalism. It's unique and specialness, right, in comparison to other nations and regions of the world on those issues, right? Racial capitalism. Simply put, and if you don't mind, there is a quote and a definition I'd like to read of it, but I'll summarize it first. It's essentially the idea that racism and capitalism are intertwined, that they are in fact coeval in their development in world history, right? It's not that one came before the other, they arrived simultaneously and developed simultaneously outside or from feudal Europe, right? There's a lot of history, a lot of scholarship on this. The primary scholar that was credited for this idea is a historian, Cedric Robinson, who in his book Black Marxism essentially begins to explain this process. And he does that by going into old feudal Europe, right? So the key point here is that racism isn't just the idea of inequality between blacks and whites. It's an ideology of the inequality of races and the hierarchy of races, right? And so capitalism, then racial capitalism, is the idea that capitalism has always functioned on racial inequality. So if you will, just let me read this definition, if you will, right? And it's from a scholar by the name of Jody Melamed. She published this in an article entitled Racial Capitalism. I think I can get the reference for you and share it with you later, and then you can disseminate it, or distribute it. But here's the definition, right? The term racial capitalism requires its users to recognize that capitalism is racial capitalism. Capital can only be capital when it is accumulating, and it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Capitalists with the means of production / workers without the means of subsistence, creditors and debtors, conquerors of land, made property, the dispossessed and removed. These antimonies of accumulation require loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value. And racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. So it's kind of a long-winded definition, but it gets very specific, right, into telling the different ways that these relationships are built. And that, again, it's not just black-white. For example, in Cedric Robinson's book, one of his early forms of describing this is essentially the colonialism of Ireland by the UK, by Britain, right? And how particularly the British working class came to racialize and see themselves as different, as better than the Irish, that the Irish were savage and subhuman. And that is very much a racial logic and a racial discourse that helped to feed the development of working class solidarity, particularly in Britain, right? Okay, so that's racial capitalism. Again, just the notion that the two are intertwined, right? And that they're coeval in their development, in global development, right? The third one, emancipatory internationalism, right? I view this as both, it's an idea as well as a movement that's been connected across centuries, right? So just think of emancipatory internationalism as a broad-based global freedom struggle, freedom movement, right? That has involved anti-colonial struggles, anti-imperial struggles, as well as, pro-democracy, pro-equality, right? Make sure I got that right. Yeah, pro-freedom, pro-equality struggles, right? And that it's not unique to one particular time of history, but that indeed we can trace examples that are connected across, right, centuries. And so in this book, that's a key concept he uses. And the two, if I may point out, are actually in tension, right? That is racial capitalism and emancipatory internationalism. In fact, emancipatory internationalism in Paul Ortiz's telling is the response to racial capitalism. It is what is going to frustrate it. It is what we need to overcome it, essentially.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't necessarily draw that connection, but I could see that now. We'll come back to the idea of emancipatory internationalism in some of the book, but as a follow-up question, and this wasn't in the notes I sent you, but it was striking to me that these definitions, and as you were reading the definition of racial capitalism, how is juxtaposed against how I learned history as a person growing up in the United States. I learned that capitalism was king and was the means for us to maintain our freedom, really, right? And along with that narrative, the idea that like under capitalism, everyone can succeed if they work hard enough, right? It's like a free access. That's the whole point, is a free market and everyone has equal access. This book and many others that probably others have been reading during this time really kind of refutes that notion pretty strongly. But was there anything in the book that stood out to you that might be really helpful as an example of how racial capitalism is really, like, we need to tell different stories to illustrate racial capitalism?
Yeah, definitely. I think the preeminent example is slavery, and it's why he begins with slavery, right? And he shows that slavery just isn't a unique story to the United States, but this indeed is why his history is one of Black and Latinx people, because the history of the Americas, plural, right? We cannot begin to understand the history of slavery in the United States or the development of capitalism without analyzing them together and viewing them transnationally, right? So again, if we understand that slavery, as an institution, as a form of labor control, right, is developing, it doesn't create this clear break with feudal Europe, because slavery exists well into, right, at least officially past the middle of the 19th century, but several forms of indentured servitude, right, and unfree labor even persisted into the 20th century, even in the United States, with our treatment of indigenous people in particular, right? Yeah, I think in regards to slavery, we view and tell the story of slavery, we being, as a nationalist frame for a nation, that we do that by saying, oh, this was kind of like a necessary evil, right? Like the United States we know it was colonies, and this was kind of like a system that was imposed upon us, and, there's not much the United States could really do about it, until the Civil War kind of forced the issue, and then we solved it because the Civil War ended that question. Well, and then we had a bunch of Jim Crow stuff and civil rights, what I mean? It's just, so under strict scrutiny, it just doesn't hold, right? When we analyze the Constitution itself, we see that the founding documents preserve slavery, right? They embed it within the Constitution. They embed it within our form of representation in the House of Representatives, right? So it is indeed fundamental, right, to our nation's political institutions, but also its economic one, right? And if capitalism is the economic engine, so-called, right, that drives American history, and slavery then is embedded into the foundation of our political and economic institutions, then you can't really separate the two, right? So it's a matter of how we teach that, and we need to teach them together instead of kind of saying, yeah, like we have these two halves of the country, and one was kind of stuck in this feudal society where slavery was king, and the North was the free slave society. Well, was a free society. Well, and that's just baloney. They depended upon each other, right? There is as much racism and much dependence upon slavery in the North as there was in the South. So again, it's more of understanding that these things are all intertwined and they're connected, and they're not developing in vacuums or in isolation.
Right, right. So that comment raised a couple of other questions that came up for me as I read the book. First of all, like the interconnection between all of these different minority groups really stood out to me. Like we have the example of Native Americans being removed from their lands to make way for slaves to be able to farm those lands, right? And of slaves and other abolitionists supporting Latin Americans in their fights for freedom, things like that. So it was really interesting to me to see that those interconnections between minority groups have been there for so long, right? They can't be necessarily separated into separate groups just because we, for cleanliness, we want to like keep them distinct, right? But are there lessons, we'll come back to maybe some of the historical details, but are there any lessons that right now we can learn from these historical accounts about approaching these intersections and advancing social causes where we do have different groups involved?
Definitely, definitely. I think I'll give a few examples of that or answers to that. First, in regards to intersectionality or coalition building, or the phrase that we use a lot now is allyship, right? And all these discussions about how do we make that happen? Is it possible? Will it actually work? Well, read this book, right? If you read this book, then yes, it is possible. Not only is it possible, but it's essential for challenging forms of oppression. I mean, we just within our own recent history and memory, look at the civil rights movement, right? Or at least the traditional framing of it, right? There's a traditional framing that goes from 54, right, with Rosa Parks, right, to 65, right, with the Voting Rights Act, right? Just look at that. Like, what wakens America, right? It's national news coverage. It's people turning on their TVs, and white middle-class folk are seeing Black middle-class folk having dogs sicked on them and all that stuff. So what does that do? That coalesces, right? It wakens up, a big portion of white America to say, oh, this is wrong, and we should do something about it, right? So even just in our very recent history, but it's much deeper than that, and that's the point of this book. So it's not only possible, but it's essential for challenging various forms of oppression is one. The second one is that it works. It works, right? Slavery doesn't end without the global abolitionist movement, which was global, and it was multiracial, and it was, it involved men and women, a lot of women, right? And then that leads to other movements, right? Like suffrage, which was multiracial too, which was also involving men and women, right? So, and it was, did I say it was international? If I didn't, it was international, right? So it works. And that, as the other point makes, is that it has these movements, intersectional, allyship, coalitional movements, right, across races, across genders, across classes, right? It has shaped our nation's history. It's made us better, This is not, some radical history, right, that is revisionist. This is what happened. This is how our Constitution has been pushed and expanded to include people that it initially ignored, right? Namely Black, Indigenous people, of course, women, including white women, immigrants, etc. Immigrants from particular parts of the world, right? So I leave with those things, right? It's possible, it works, and it's transformed our history, and particularly that national and global. It's done that.
So I think this book also, like you said, highlights that this is just part of the story. It's not changing the story. It's just adding voices that haven't been heard before, right? I think that raises for me, I was a social studies teacher before I went to law school, just for a short time. I didn't teach history. I taught world geography, which is similar, but I think the question for educators, and including college professors like yourself, is, okay, how do we make those decisions? There's always going to have to be some selection in terms of the material and the curriculum that you choose to cover. How do we go about making those decisions in a way that gives a more complete story?
That's
Maybe
a great question.
but
Yeah, and I'll tell you the process by which I came about it. The first point I'd say is it's a matter of having like a guiding philosophy, a guiding perspective or interpretation that you've developed, right, through your study, through your examination, critical analysis, right, both of your education, your lived experience, all that comes to form together to form a worldview, right, a perspective that we can, say is a philosophy, right? And so for me, and the classes and the type of scholarship and the scholars that I was exposed to, I mean, at one point I sit back and I was like, this is completely different than what I understood growing up, right? Particularly K through 12 education. And perhaps I wasn't paying attention enough. I mean, that could be part of it, but and probably true in my case. But more so, I mean, particularly the multi-ethnic and multi-racial character of our heritage, of a national heritage, of a global heritage, of people that, were doing for themselves. They weren't waiting around, whether they're, we say they're marginalized folks, or minorities, or underrepresented. This is just a human thing, right? People fight oppression. People move and they do stuff, right? All people do stuff, right? And it's ideologies like racism, right, and sexism and classism that cloud our vision and help us and prevent us from seeing that, right? So when we finally realize this, it's kind of takes us to, it's upon us to realize what we see and do something about it, right? So that's the perspective and, say, philosophy that we have to develop. And for me, again, going through my graduate education, I realized that my education wasn't just about what I was reading and regurgitating that, but that I need to develop my own voice, both in scholarship, both in teaching, my own perspective. Like, that's what would make me unique. That's what would make me, that's why, it would make me useful or beneficial, right, to an institution, to a university, right? And that'd be clear. I had to be clear on that, right, what that was. And so for me, that essentially formed around what we now call anti-racism, right? That type of perspective, right, which is, challenging, right, racist and inequality, the ideas that promote inequality, right? And so that's the first thing, right? That kind of philosophy or perspective. The second thing in making these choices, right? So you have to have your guiding philosophy, right? Your interpretation, but then you also have to know your audience. You have to figure out who the audience is, right? Because you can't teach the same thing the same way to two different groups. I mean, I learned that really quickly. My previous teaching positions were in Los Angeles at two really large universities. The one where I got my degree from, USC, I had a postdoc there where I taught classes in history and in American studies. And then I also had a lectureship in the Department of Chicano and Chicana Studies at UCLI, right? And so those are very different audiences, right? Just those two institutions alone, right? One being a large private university is much more conservative, right, than the large public university that had been the basis of social movements, right, essentially, that had transformed curriculum, like the production of ethnic studies, right, Chicano studies, African American studies, right? UCLA was one of those centers, right? So they had very different institutional histories, but they also, which meant they had very different student bodies. One, you had rich students at both of them, no doubt, students with privilege, but UCLA in particular had a lot more working class and first generation and immigrant students that I taught, USC had some of those, but they were a clear minority in the population. They were a substantial one, and one that USC was doing better to increase, but they were a substantial one. Whereas at UCLA, it was, I mean, it's seemingly like, I was surrounded by working class kids, right? A lot that had transferred from community college and stuff like that, right? So I come to BYU, and again, it's a very different audience, right? So my philosophy is the same, right? I want to promote essentially anti-racist ideas, right? By showing people how people of color have always been seminal, transformative, historical actors, right? They've been agents for themselves, right? And for us collectively, right? That's the idea, right? Now, how I do that, what books I choose, the tone of those books, my own tone, in my lectures. I learned after my first year, I had to attenuate that, right? I had to adjust it, because to a, predominantly not just, white, non-Hispanic audience, but one that comes from, at least most of our students demographic are coming from what we'd probably call like, middle class, background, but also more conservative, right? Politically, definitely socially, I'll flat out say it, most of our students are coming from straight out segregated places, right? They come from neighborhoods where they have very little, they don't realize it's segregated, but very little interactions with people from diverse cultures, opinions, background, et cetera, right? And that's not their fault. I'm just saying, like, that's what I had to realize we were doing here. They're different. There's a diversity within, BYU student body, but it's just very different. And so I had to essentially learn that there was things that I couldn't take for granted anymore. I couldn't take, certain knowledge or terms for granted, certain like acceptable social knowledge, about people with different religious views or, class views. I just couldn't take a lot of that stuff for granted anymore because I wasn't talking to a predominantly either working class or minority audience in one case, because I was teaching, again, in the Chicano Studies department at UCLA. So that they're big classes, but they're all brown, essentially, right? That's very different than going to biggish classes at BYU that maybe had one or two, students of color, right? And often those students of color are actually international students, so they don't even share, right, this kind of understood experience of racism within the United States. Like they're becoming Black, in the United States, or they're becoming Latino, at BYU and not understanding what that stuff is, right? So you have to adjust those things for the audience that you're speaking to. And it takes time to do that. That's the frustrating thing. There are painful lessons in there, and I learned some painful lessons. And one of them was adopting a book like this, which, promotes I realized I needed to really promote a transnational type of narrative, a really coalitional allyship narrative, rather than I was using before like books that were very deeply into, a book that was on, the Black experience during Reconstruction, like one big book on that, and then another book that was on like migration, another book on race. And so I realized I needed to blend these things a lot more so the students could see how they're interacting, right? And seeing how they're all part of them, kind of like Venn diagrams, right? They're all overlapping, right? I needed to try to get that across to them. Otherwise, they were still understanding things in separate spheres, right? And not seeing the intersection or the overlap so much.
That's really, I think, useful advice. We do have some educators that join us on these calls as well. And I think that's, really, really useful. I should add to, and I should have said that this at the beginning, but for any of the audience, feel free to jump down the chat or the Q&A and add your questions as we go. We will have a portion at the end as well, but definitely feel free to jump in. One phrase that you used in that last answer was, or one thing that you said was that you like to highlight people of color as seminal transformative actors. I really like that notion. In the book at one point, let me see where it is. It's chapter 3. So Paul Ortiz is talking about Mexicans in the 1800s, and he talks about them as landless laborers, right? And how they continued to be landless laborers for generations and occupied this underpaid working class. The question that I initially raised for you was whether we still see repercussions of that today. I'd like to still talk about that maybe in a minute, but how did these Latinx individuals, Mexicans, that as Paul Ortiz identifies specifically, become those seminal transformative actors, especially in the labor movement, perhaps? And I think that was a really poignant example that the book gave.
So I'm trying to rephrase I'm trying to understand the question. Sorry, my mind drifted.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So it was a long-winded question. We have this idea of landless laborers, and then I think it's a contrast to think of those same landless laborers as seminal transformative actors in their own like world and experience. Right. So what examples do we have of that maybe are highlighted in the book?
Yeah, so a big part of the book is, right, like labor history, just kind of old-fashioned labor history. But the difference is that it's not a labor history that is divided by race, which was, actually a key part of, labor history and labor unions in the United States, right? The AFL, Samuel Gompers was a very conservative and restrictionist type of, labor organization that was always anti-immigrant, right? And definitely racist, right? Didn't advocate for the inclusion of racial others. And so, the examples that we see, and, from early on in the book, you see this in like the Great Depression. In particular, one of my favorite examples are, women in the South that are, striking out, doing wildcat strikes and doing broadcast organizing in order to call for the same protections that the New Deal, right, has secured for white laborers, right? And these Black women right away, seamstresses, laundry workers, etc., they're saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. And particularly one like at a paper bag factory is one of the stories, right? But they're like, why don't we get that too, right? We're citizens, right? And so it's like they didn't ask for permission. They didn't go to another labor union and say, hey, will you support us? They created their own, and they went on strike. And then they organized and they got other people to go on strike, right? There's mass sympathy strikes going all throughout the South, right? Of Black women that were, again, just saying no. We see this again in regards to Latinos and Hispanics, both in the New Deal period. I mean, he mentions Emma Tenayuca, who's one of my favorite just labor activists and historical figures. At 16 years old, this girl, because she's 16, leads a major strike of pecan shellers in San Antonio. 16. Where did she learn how to do that? Like, I guarantee you, like, she grew up in Texas. None of her teachers taught her to stand up to, unfair labor practices, right? I mean, inherent, she had, a sense of social justice within her. Obviously, it came from her family. It probably came from her faith. A lot of these people, it comes from their faith too, but not always. And they stood up and said no. I mean, one of the most, again, famous movements in United States history is the farm worker movement, right? We see that with, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and literally hundreds of others in that movement, right? Who, again, came from segregated communities, often had dropped out of school because they lived in the Juan Crow Southwest, and thereby weren't able to, necessarily finish high school due to socioeconomic circumstances. They were encouraged to actually, drop out of school and work in the fields. And so what did Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta do? I mean, they organized the most marginalized of workers, right? Immigrants and the children of immigrants, people that were seen and so-called viewed as not American because they spoke another language, they had other cultural practices. And, for a moment, they did indeed transform labor practices in agriculture. There's a bigger story there, that continues. It's that makes it more complicated, and why particularly the agricultural industry didn't say end up like the auto workers industry, right? There are persistent reasons for that, and we can talk about that. But I mean, they secured incredible protections, right, for agricultural workers, right? I mean, the rights to have bathrooms installed in the fields, the rights to transition from the short-handled hoe, to a long-handled hoe, right? I mean, the short-handled hoe was used as a key tool of oppression, because they used it not just because they were cheap and didn't want to, buy a long-handled hose, but it allowed the labor bosses and contractors to look over the field and see who was hunched over. So if you were hunched over, right, it meant you were working. If you're standing up, you weren't working, right? So it was a very visible and clear connection there. And so they banned that. They got them, old age worker pensions. There's all sorts of stuff that they did, right? I mean, massive, movement, not just domestic, but international, to boycott table grapes, right? Again, it was incredibly significant, right? And again, what did Cesar Chavez do and Dolores Huerta do? They started a movement where there was none, right? Where historically the labor movement had struggled to go to, immigrants and the children of immigrants and organize them. And that's where, given to its credit, and these historical figures, not perfect, they have issues. Both Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta have issues, but I mean, the fact that they recognized that was the people, that's what they want to devote their life to. Again, where did they learn from that? Again, they didn't learn it in school. They learned it in their households. They learned it in their communities, and they went and did something about it. And it changed America, because even with the limitations of, again, with the farm worker movement, it brought in coalitions and allyship. I mean, you had, just after the Freedom Summer, right, students are looking like, oh, okay, The bus rides are done. What are we going to do next? Oh, there's a Cesar Chavez guy. Let's go do that. I mean, it trained generations, 2 generations of activists that have led the fight for racial, gender, sexual equality, et cetera, class equality in the United States. So, and it again teaches us that we can't just view these moments in their little bubbles or microcosms. We have to follow the storylines. We have to follow the narratives, right? Where did Marshall Gans go, and what did he do after he worked with Cesar Chavez, right? And all these other people, right? Well, you see, wow, they went and founded other movements and other organizations, and many of them became lawyers, or they became, religious leaders, right? That spoke out against these issues.
Yeah, the whole history of the labor movement that was included in the book was super fascinating to me. And I especially appreciated the example of the hospitality union in Las Vegas that was highlighted, because we've been hearing a lot about that with the current election and the role that they play, in politics even today. So I think that you're right. I mean, it's fascinating that they didn't know, they didn't know what they were doing, but they just did something, right? And it worked. So I love that. So you talked about a couple of actors in these movements that were highlighted in the book. And there were a few that I had not really known about at all. One of those was Jose Maria Morelos. I loved his vision and kind of the idealism that he brought. He had this idea early on, right? So this is before the labor movements and all of that, that Mexico and the United States could have formed a beautiful bond between the two of them. So again, there was this opportunity for coalition building, but it didn't happen, right? We see that it didn't happen. So why is that? Were there US missteps, Mexican missteps? Like what? I'm sure there's a whole host of reasons, but are there any key things that happened that made it so that didn't come to fruition?
Yeah, I love that this is a second chapter of the book. It's such a powerful chapter, and particularly for accomplishing Ortiz's goal, which is to, again, fight this notion of American exceptionalism, right? To bring Mexico into the narrative very early and to say, oh, here's a revolutionary in Mexico, which is Jose Maria Morelos, right? He was one of, among the big 3, right, that helped to push the independence movement, right, from a Spanish colonial domination in Mexico, right? And that he actually appeals directly, right, to the President of the United States to join him, to join Mexico, right, in a struggle against slavery, against colonialism, right? The audacity, right? I mean, I could just see, right, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting, is it Madison? Yeah, James Madison thinking, who does this dude think he is writing me a letter, right? I mean, and definitely us as, if we're educated in American institutions, right, US institutions, we're trained to think that way. Like, who the heck did Mexico think they were trying to get the United States to help them out in an anti-colonial struggle? Well, it wasn't just Mexico. Essentially, almost every independence movement in Latin America and the Caribbean made appeals to the United States, right? And saying, you did it, we want to do what you did, right? Let us join you, or you join us, right? And let's do this together, right? Let's build this international solidarity to finally throw off colonialism. And the key institution undergirding colonialism was slavery, right? So, the reason, the then question is, well, why didn't that work, right? And it didn't work because James Madison was a slaveholder, It's like, it's kind of true, right? Slavery was so embedded in American institutions, government, politics, its economy, but not just those things, right? Its culture. You can imagine James Madison just thinking, like, again, who does this guy think he is? We are not the same, right? And John, John Quincy Adams was the same way. He gives, John Quincy as an example there too, as a Secretary of State. I mean, the one that is one of the primary proponents, the Secretary of State of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Which is basically the signal to Europe to say, hands off, right? Hands off the Western Hemisphere, it's ours. We're gonna do what we want. You got your own little part of the world over there, this is ours, right? And that the idea of, again, throwing off slavery, which Mexico did, right? Mexico was doing, right? And they had to do that, right? In order to form an independence movement. It's important to understand that. They had a racially mixed population of Africans, mestizos, indigenous people, right, etc. I mean, there's no way you're creating a broad-based movement without unifying these people, right? So it was necessity for them, for Mexico to do that. And the United States clearly saw their history, their own movement as something very different, as, again, political equality not involving all the races of the world, but being, a kind of, a white man's job, a white man's mission. And so, I mean, that's why it failed, essentially, is that, the United States basically ignored it, and not just ignored it, but actually worked to, overthrow that movement, right? The United States was incredibly upset that there's a whole other branch of the Underground Railroad that went to Mexico. Went to the Spanish territory in Spanish Florida for, there. It went into the Caribbean and it went to Mexico, into, Texas in particular, prior to it being Texas. And even afterwards, it still went through Texas to what remained, as Mexico. And I mean, one of the stories I love in that chapter 2 is how the United States is trying to force the new Mexican nation, again, not New Mexico, but the nascent Mexican nation, right, to essentially agree to a fugitive slave law, right, and to pass some type of legislation that's going to get these slave backs. And Mexico's like, no, we're not going to do it. I mean, so how does that shift our understanding of the balance of power, right? If a new nascent, nation is literally thumbing its nose at the United States, right? I mean, it just shifts our, again, that idea of American exceptionalism is, oh, the United States has always told Mexico what to do, because, we were more advanced technologically and, and industrially. And maybe the industrial and technological point is true, but politically and socially, I would say no. The Mexican, Constitution is incredibly progressive. I mean, what they promoted, both in 1810 and later on in 1910, when it was revised after, the revolution, is extraordinary. And yeah, there's been issues there, and they haven't achieved it all. And there's a lot of issues, and reasons for that, right, involving, colonialism and imperialism, from its northern neighbor. But I mean, the fact that the ideals were there and they've striven for them, is a key part of the story, and something that causes us to question, again, the own stories that we tell about our nation's founding truths. And if those are embedded in our nation, then why didn't they do that? Why didn't it take that risk, that chance?
Yeah, that was the question that was definitely resurfacing in my mind as I read, and the only justification was, I mean, if you're going to be honest about it, was what, John Quincy Adams said, which was, they're not free men, they're not free white men. We are. That's the only difference. And so, yeah, it was really telling to be that, I guess, candid about it. So
also, what was inspiring too is that even though, the political leadership in the United States ignored them, right, the Black leadership didn't. Right. Frederick Douglass joined with Morelos, right? As well as others, in the Black freedom struggle. I mean, they did build solidarity. They spoke at conferences. They gave speeches together, right? Douglass spoke against, the war against Mexico. He saw it for what it was. It was a territorial grab to expand slavery, right? And so it wasn't just in his own self-interest, but he saw this, and again, in a moment of international and in human solidarity, right?
Right. They were definitely dedicated to the cause globally, right? Not to just their own interests. So I really did appreciate that. I want to shift gears just a little bit, and then we'll maybe open up for other questions. But one of the things that came up, and our staff at UCLI highlighted this as something that we were hoping you'd address. At the end of the book, there's a section titled Note on Sources, where Paul Ortiz explains that he's gained much greater access over time to a bunch of resources that have been helpful to really complete the narrative. Have you seen the same thing in your research, and what's the significance of this expansion of new, or the expansion of access, right, to these sources?
Yeah, so there's two things that he's talking about in particular, sort of out of order. They are digital resources, right, and digital archives, which have been vastly expanded over the last 20 years in particular. But he speaks to another one that's incredibly important to this book, and he's written a few books. This is not his first, but to all the research that he's done was oral histories, right? And oral histories are incredibly important for populations that are underrepresented in our historical record, right? I mean, if our institutions, themselves and their way of documenting themselves have followed this American exceptionalist type of kind of notion, which they have, right? To the conquerors go the spoils, and the history books, right? Then it becomes a challenge to tell the stories of underrepresented people, right, and marginalized and disenfranchised people. So one of those is that he's done a lot of oral history work, and he's been a part of oral history projects since he was a graduate student. And so and I could say similarly to myself, and I think that had an incredible impact in helping me realize, as I said earlier, develop that philosophy, that kind of view of how I needed to teach and research, right? Because it introduced me to a perspective of poor, marginalized people doing for themselves that I had never seen before, because it wasn't in books, right? So there's that aspect for it. And those have become, those two have gone through processes of digitization. There's a lot of archives now that you can access through, at least web form, or you can make connections to, archives, public history archives at certain universities, and they'll send you stuff, right? So just, the advancement of technology and electronic communication has made that, finding those narrative threads, right, and getting access to them, I think in some way easier. Also, I'll say more challenging, because there's just so much material now. There's so much that you're expected to do, and so much that you can do, that it's hard sometimes really narrowing it down, right? But then his again point to larger internet and digitization materials and archives have been incredibly important, right? I mean, you can find historical documents now for all sorts of stuff. I mean, I love using the Library of Congress. They have a phenomenal, and relatively easily searchable database and archives online. I use a lot of their images for my lectures and presentations, But again, those official archives, that have all these great, wonderful documents, that have our court records, that have our, institutional type records, they are limited. They're limited in the perspective that they provide. And so we have to bring those into conversation with, again, like the oral histories, right? The other side of the perspective to show, well, this is what the document says, and this is how people experienced it, right? There are other ways to do that, other type of sources to use, but those are two in particular that he points out that are really important to his project.
Thank you. That's useful to put some of this in perspective, because I think, at least for me, I don't always appreciate all the work that's going on behind the scenes by historians and archivists and all of those professionals that make it possible. So I thank you for that. I'm going to open up now. Do any of the attendees have any questions we want to raise? I have others, but I'd like to give the opportunity for others to ask questions if you have any. You can do it in the Q&A or in the chat. Either way is fine. Maybe as people are thinking of questions, I can ask one more. I feel like this book necessarily only kind of scratches the surface of some of this. And it did pique my interest, though, in other, like, continuing study. Do you have any recommendations of good books or other additional resources that participants can go to engage in further study?
I really appreciate that question. Thank you for asking it. And I appreciate it because what I try to stress to my students is that, This is a relatively short book. It's only about roughly 200 pages. It covers a lot of history. And so one of the easiest ways to knock it is to say, oh, well, that's just one book.
Right.
And it's very short. And in fact, I assign it with two other books, one that focuses on Native American history. I'll actually share that one too. That one's called, I started teaching it about a year ago. It's called The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. It's by David Truer. It's much thicker. But I explain why that is. I mean, you know, all publications, all publishers, all book projects aren't the same. And so it's not, the point is to a lack of resources, a lack of material. It oftentimes has to do with like this particular series. This book is in a bigger series that is kind of based on like a people's history of the United States, which is, you know, a project, a history that was tied back to the historian Howard Zinn. If you've ever watched the movie Good Will Hunting, it's actually referenced in that movie. So that's the book that he's like, oh yeah, this book will knock your socks off, right? And says it in his real Bostonian accent, right? Southie accent. Anyways, so the point that I want to make here is go to the notes. You know, the notes section in the back of this book in particular are really good. And it is the breadcrumb trail, if you will, right? To not only where he gets his resources, his information, but also, again, a much more vast and expansive reading list that shows that, you know, he's building on scholarship that has been around for decades. You know, again, the idea of racial capitalism, most students, again, they're going to encounter it the first time in this book. Cedric Robinson, he published Black Marxism. I'm going to look real quick. I think this book was like in the mid 80s or something when he came out with it. 83 is when he published this book. So again, that idea has been around for a long time, right? And I mean, Black Marxism itself is a very dense book. The footnotes on it are incredible. But anyways, so it's a much deeper and longer history. So the first thing you can do is look to the sources, look to his own footnotes. Other books, again, I think, again, what's left out of this book, right, is he does include some aspects of indigeneity, indigenous people, but that's a huge gap in our understanding of the history of the Americas and our own nation's history. So I definitely suggest The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. Also on that, within this series, there's a book called, you know, an indigenous people's history of the United States. I actually used to use it prior to The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. The reason why, again, I switched from that is because The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee actually fits the timeline for my survey course a bit better. It essentially begins in the 1890s, even though it actually gives a big a summary of kind of 10,000 years of history before that in its opening chapter. But the tone of Ruth Dunbar Ortiz's book, which is an Indigenous Peoples History, that's in the same series, it's abrasive, it's provocative to say the least. And that's why I used to assign it, because I think we need to read it. I'll give you an example, right? She opens up by saying, the history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism and genocide, period. You know, let that sink in. I mean, if that's like the first thing you read in the first couple of sentences of a book, my mouth hit the floor. You know, but that book was important. It taught me what settler colonialism. I had no idea what that was. I'd gone through most of a graduate program and still didn't really understand what settler colonialism was. And that book clearly helped me to see in a very, you know, abrasive tone that made me uncomfortable, yes, but it taught me, you know. And so I realized that probably wasn't the best book to use to try to teach Indigenous peoples at BYU. But it's still a phenomenal book nonetheless, and one that I definitely suggest. A couple others real quick on race, one of my favorite books. Again, I used to assign it. Again, there's no particular reason, there's nothing wrong with the book that I don't, but just because of like time and space limitations, I can't have my students read 2,000 pages, right? Another phenomenal book is called The History of White People. It's a very accessible book. It's published by Norton, so it's, you know, mass market press. It's by the historian Nell Irvin Painter, emeritus professor at Princeton. I mean, just a phenomenal scholar. And it's about the idea of whiteness itself and how that's an idea tied to ancient history. and how it's completely untenable. It's like the only way the idea of this, there's such thing as a white race has existed and continued is because it's been allowed to expand. So the idea that we think that, you know, the white race or a white race is a thing, right, is entirely socially constructed. And she just completely deconstructs that and debunks the whole thing from, again, ancient history all the way to contemporary society. So there's that one. If I can give one or two more real quick. There's a book on, I have these like all on the shelf right here. A great book on that's entitled The Other Slavery. It's actually about indigenous slavery in the Americas by Andres Reséndez. Phenomenal book. Again, just basically talking about, you know, the long established history of unequal and unfree labor in the Americas pertaining to indigenous folk. And I'll stop with these two. Okay, these are all very accessible texts, and they're why I'm sharing these ones. These are not academic monographs. They're easy to read. So the second to last one is Our America, A Hispanic History of the United States. And then the last one I'll share is, and these are all just because they're staring in front of me, there's many other wonderful ones, is The Color of Law. And it's about the history of segregation in the United States. And that segregation wasn't accidental, right? Particularly segregation in the North. It was intentional. This book works to break down that false dichotomy of, you know, between the intentionality, at least, and the role of the government in de facto as opposed to de jure segregation, that essentially it eliminates that distinction, saying, you know, it's all been primarily driven by government policy, is essentially the argument of that book. So those are a few.
Thank you so much. That last book was definitely eye-opening for me as I read through it. It was good. It was great. Thank you for sharing all those and for sharing your thoughts generally. I think especially as you were talking about those books, it hit home for me, and as I was reading this, that it's so important to invite different voices into the conversation. Even if their tone is abrasive or hard to handle, that's important too for us to get used to, not requiring people to be a certain way as they come to the table. So thank you so much for highlighting all that and for joining us today. And thank you to everyone that attended. We usually try and wrap up right around 5. So thank you again, Dr. Gonzales. And next week, for all those who have been attending regularly and that might be listening to the recording, we will not have our normal webinar because we're encouraging everyone to watch the vice presidential debate. We'll see how it differs from last night. And yeah, and we're going to have a watch party though for UCLI, and there will be more details coming about that. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week. Thank you again, Dr. Gonzales.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.